Nomination, Department of Justice, Harmeet Dillon of California to be an Assistant Attorney General.
President,
The senator from Kentucky.
ask unanimous consent to proceed to legislative session.
Without objection.
I ask that the Senate execute the order of March 26th with respect to S.J. Res. 37.
Under the previous order, the Committee on Finance is discharged from further consideration of S.J. Res. 37, which the clerk will report.
S.J. Res. 37, joint resolution terminating the national emergency declared to impose duties on articles imported from Canada.
Under the previous order, there are now 6 hours of debate equally divided on the joint resolution.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kentucky.
taxation without representation is tyranny, bellowed James Otis. In the days and weeks and years leading up to the American Revolution, this became the rallying cry of American patriots. No taxation without representation. The American patriots thought that a distant parliament in England, where they had no representation, had no right to tax them. This was the rallying cry: no taxation without representation. Our founding fathers believed so strongly in this, they embodied it in our Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't allow any one man or woman to raise taxes. It must be the body of Congress. Now, this wasn't new. This was part of maybe a 1,000-year tradition from Magna Carta on. In Magna Carta, it is stated, no taxation without the common council of the realm. Even at that time, they were chafing at one man, the king, determining the taxes for the land. 100 years before our Revolutionary War, in the English Civil War, there was a debate over parliamentary supremacy versus supremacy of the king. They did not want to pay taxes that weren't approved by the Parliament. In 1683, the New York Charter on Liberties, the beginning charter for the colony of New York, stated, no taxation without representation. After this English Civil War, the English Bill of Rights embodied no taxation without the consent of Parliament. This principle was long-standing. It was non-negotiable. This was what sparked the revolution. And yet today we are here before the Senate because one person in our country wishes to raise taxes. Well, this is contrary to everything our country was founded upon. One person is not allowed to raise taxes. The Constitution forbids it. The Constitution was so concerned with the power of taxes, which some have said the power of taxes is the power to destroy. But our founding fathers were so concerned with this that they said, no, the president will not have the power to legislate. The president will not have the power to tax. Only Congress will be able to tax the people, and only by originating tax bills in the House. It was that specific. They were so mortified, they were so worried by having a monarchy, they were so worried about having all the power gravitate to the executive that they said we must split the powers. They based a lot of their thinkings on Montesquieu. Montesquieu wrote in the 1740s, 40, 50 years before our Constitution, Montesquieu wrote that when the legislative and executive powers are united in one, there can be no liberty. This is something that our founding fathers took to heart. They said, we must separate the powers. We must at all costs limit the power of the presidency. This isn't about political party. I voted for and supported President Trump, but I don't support the rule of one person. We are set, the president is set to have a 25% tax on goods coming from Canada and Mexico. This is a tax, plain and simple, on the American people. But one person can't do that. Our founding fathers said, no, that would be illegal for one person to raise taxes. It has to come to Congress. It has to originate in the House. This has gone on for 200 and some odd years. You can't simply declare an emergency and say, well, the Constitutional Republic was great, but gosh, we've got an emergency. Our times are dire. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said there are no exemptions for emergency. There was no exemption for a pandemic. There is no exemption for emergencies. The taxation clause stands. It's an important part of the Constitution. Taxes must originate in the House. They must be voted on in Congress. No one man can raise taxes on the people. They are set to do this through a process in which an emergency has been declared. But realize this, one person declares an emergency, the president, and even if we are successful, which I think we will be successful here today, a majority will vote to say this is wrong-headed and the emergency should end. We'd have to go to the House. But even if we were successful in the House, the president would veto it. It would take a 2/3 vote in order to stop an emergency. That's such a burden that we need to consider reforming the emergency powers and reversing this. I think a president can have times that there are emergencies, and the president can declare emergency, but it should last 30 days at most. At the end of 30 days, the emergency would be brought to the people's house, the House of Representatives and the senators, and we would vote whether to affirm or uphold an emergency. Right now, the pretense of this emergency is fentanyl. I don't discount fentanyl. I know families who have lost kids to fentanyl. But there's more fentanyl going from the United States into Canada than there is coming from Canada into the United States. There is no emergency. The Canadians have actually been cooperative with us and said they will try to do even more. But the problem isn't in Canada. Even if the problem is valid, even if that is something that we all agree on, you can't have a country ruled by emergency. You can't have a country without a separation of powers, without checks and balances. Madison put it this way. Madison said that we would pit ambition against ambition, that all men, and frankly all women, are motivated by self-interest and the self-accumulation or aggrandizement of power, and so we would limit their power by pitting ambition against ambition. We would give some of the power to the House, some of the power to the Senate, some to the president. There would be checks and balances and a jostling for power, but we would check and balance each other. Part of the problem we face today with this emergency, though, is that Congress has abdicated their power. Not just recently, not just for this president. This is a bipartisan problem. I am a Republican. I am a supporter of Donald Trump. But this is a bipartisan problem. I don't care if the president is a Republican or a Democrat. I don't want to live under emergency rule. I don't want to live where my representatives cannot speak for me and have a check and balance on power. One person can make a mistake. And guess what? Tariffs are a terrible mistake. They don't work. They will lead to higher prices. They are a tax, and they have historically been bad for our economy. But even if this were something that was magic and was going to be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, I wouldn't want to live under emergency rule. I would want to live in a constitutional republic where there are checks and balances against the excesses of both sides, right or left. If one person rules, that person could make a horrible mistake. On things so important as war, it's the same thing. We don't want a president just to go to war because a president might get angry with some country or have a vendetta. We're supposed to vote. That's why declaration of war. War originates also in Congress. But we've lost so many of these things, and so much of this, it's Congress's fault for giving it. Over the last 70 years, there's probably a dozen pieces of legislation where Congress said to the president, here, take this power. Create emergencies, put on tariffs, negotiate for us because we're too feeble-minded to do it ourselves. But the thing is, the Constitution doesn't let us give our power away. There's something called the non-delegation clause, and it says that we're not allowed to give power away. We can't just say, here, Mr. President, take it. In this particular case, it's even worse. The rule of law, the IEPA is the acronym for it, has never been used for tariffs before and doesn't mention the word tariff. So this isn't something that was targeted in times of need. The president can have the power to put on tariffs. Never says that. This will be an extraordinary use of something never intended to be a way to have unilateral, one single person invoke a tax on the people. With regard to tariffs, let's be very clear. Tariffs are simply taxes. Tariffs don't punish foreign governments, they punish American families. When we tax imports, we raise the price of everything, from groceries to smartphones to washing machines to prescription drugs. Every dollar collected in tariff revenue comes straight out of the pockets of American consumers. Conservatives used to understand that tariffs are taxes on the American people. Conservatives used to be uniformly opposed to raising taxes because we wanted the private marketplace, the private individuals, to keep more of their income, so we were always for lower taxes. And yet now the mantra that's coming is we want higher taxes. What happened? Did we all of a sudden give up all the things we used to believe in as conservatives? I, for one, haven't. I still think more taxes is bad for the economy. More money taking out of the productive sector, the private sector, and giving to the government is a mistake. To those who still call themselves conservatives but now support tariffs, let me remind them that Milton Friedman said, "Tariffs raise prices to consumers and waste our resources." To those who still have a fond memory of Ronald Reagan on my side, Ronald Reagan said, "Protectionism costs consumers billions of dollars, damages the overall economy, and destroys jobs." Ronald Reagan's vision for America can be seen in our trading relationships with Canada. In 1986, President Reagan said, "Our trade policy rests firmly on the foundation of free and open markets." I recognize the inescapable conclusion that all history has taught: the freer the flow of world trade, the stronger the tides of human progress and peace among nations. And it's absolutely true. If you look at a chart or a graph of world trade over the last 70 years, it's gone like this. We've been trading more with each other. If you look at a world map of prosperity, it's the same curve. It's a hockey stick. It's going up exponentially. If you look at a curve of poverty, 100,000 people are escaping poverty every day around the world, and it's because of international trade. Trade is good, not bad. Think about it. If you buy something, you're trading. If you go to the store and you buy a smartphone and you give them $1,000, you want that smartphone and you don't lose. Doesn't matter where the money went, you got your smartphone. You only give money to somebody for something if you want it. If it's a voluntary trade, it's always equal. Well, it's actually always mutually beneficial. And so when people say, "Oh, we've lost and China's winning and we have a trade deficit with China," America doesn't trade with China. An individual buys a product. You are the trader. When you go to Walmart and you buy something at Walmart and you say, "My goodness, I can get this TV for $200 less than I could get it if there were only domestic TVs," you are the contractor. The U.S. government didn't buy the TV. You bought the TV and you did it because you saved $200. You're now $200 richer and you can go somewhere. You can buy gas to go on a trip somewhere. You are richer. But if trade were bad, you wouldn't buy the TV. You made the decision. The government didn't. Our government doesn't trade with their government. Our individuals buy products from their individuals. If it's a voluntary trade, everyone benefits or the trade doesn't occur. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that the United States and Canada share the world's longest international land border and are continuously at peace. Canada is a great customer of ours. In fact, Canada buys more American goods than China, Japan, England, and France combined. So do we want the Canadians to buy less of our stuff or more of our stuff? It is a crazy notion to put a 25% tariff on this enormous amount of goods. There are predictions that cars are going to cost $10,000 more because the cars go in and out. We have cars made in Kentucky, but some of the parts go to Mexico. Some of the cars go to Mexico. Some of them go to Canada. They come back. $10,000 increase. Do you love the idea of tariffs? Is it such a great word to pay $10,000 more for a car? Canada is also the leading provider of grain, livestock, meat, and poultry. The U.S. imported $97 billion worth of oil and gas from Canada last year. Canada is a major provider of cars, car parts, steel, lumber, aluminum. This amount of trading demonstrates that no American will be able to avoid the high taxes, the high prices they'll be forced to pay because of tariffs. The taxes on Canadian imports will come at a great cost to American families. The taxes on Canadian imports will make the cost of food, fuel, cars, and furniture more expensive. The former conservatives that now sing a populist tune know deep down that their advocacy of higher taxes will cause suffering for the American family. The converts to this protectionist faith cannot help but acknowledge that even they know that the tariffs will raise prices. They admit it readily. The tariffs that they put on in 2019 are still punishing the farmers in our country to such an extent that the farmers are still asking for more subsidies. When the Trump tariffs went on in 2018, 2019, the farmers immediately complained and they were given $23 billion of taxpayer money. That's an acknowledgement that the tariffs hurt farmers. So we're going to do it again, and they're all lining up, and people say we're going to have to bail them out. Are we going to have to bail out the car companies too? Are we going to have to bail out everybody that's going to be hurt by these tariffs? It's not a good idea. The administration is currently considering a bailout for farmers. The idea that the American taxpayer will have to bail out an industry to dull the pain of tariffs is not a novel one. We've seen this one. We've seen this story. What our parents told us when we were kids is still true today. Actions speak louder than words. The supporters of tariffs know that their policies impose suffering, and they are willing to spend your money to alleviate that harm. So they know tariffs are going to hurt farm exports, so they're going to take your money and give it to the farmers. What kind of policy acknowledges, hey, I got a terrible policy, it's going to hurt these people, but we'll just give them some of your money? It makes no sense at all. In addition to the previous costs, the Peterson Institute estimates that tariffs will cost the average family $1,200 a year. The Budget Lab at Yale University estimates that tariffs will cost the average family $4,200 a year. In fact, according to the analysis, tariffs could cost the least fortunate families on average $2,400. The middle class will likely pay higher costs of about $3,000. Tariffs are a cost. Taxes are a cost. If you tax a good, it's added onto the costs. This is what happens. It happens whether inflation is the tax or whether the tax is a tariff. It adds to the cost of goods and it will be passed on to the consumer. The average American family won't get the bailouts, though. If you're a special interest and the taxes hurt you, the tariffs hurt you, you'll get a bailout. But if you're just an average person working for yourself, self-employed, and the tariffs cost all of your groceries to go up, they cause your electronics to go up, no one's going to help you. You'll just pay higher prices. If you think the cost of eggs is high, just wait until the tariff hits cars. According to Goldman Sachs, the tariffs will raise the price of a car between $5,000 and $15,000. And despite arguments to the contrary, Americans know that tariffs are a tax they will have to pay. That is why vehicle sales jumped almost 13% last month, because people are trying to buy their cars before the tariff gets on their car and raises the price. People are smarter than politicians. That's nothing new. It's not just cars that will be more expensive as a result of tariffs. Energy will be more expensive. Gas prices in some parts of the country could see a 15 to 30 cent per gallon price. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the building of a single-family home could be coming up $10,000 more expensive. Why? Because we import lumber. We import steel. If we make it more expensive to import lumber from Canada and steel from Canada, the price of your house goes up. Look, people already can't buy a house because interest rates are so high. Young people are living in apartments more and more. People feel stuck in their life, and we're going to add to the price of lumber and steel to make homes even harder to purchase. It's a terrible idea. Washing machines were already almost $100 more expensive as a result of the original tariffs 4 years ago. And here's really bad news. Even beer could become more expensive. A professor at Northeastern University states that a six-pack of Corona could go up by 45 cents, but a small craft beer could be increased by as much as $1 a pint. The former and never were conservatives who try to sell tariffs as anything other than a tax cannot fool the American people, who know that their purchasing power will be weakened with every new protectionist measure unilaterally imposed by the White House. And none of these tax hikes are necessary. The populists argue that the threat of tariffs are needed to force Canada to stop the flow of illicit drugs. In fact, one of the social media posts today said there was going to be a tariff on fentanyl. Really? You think the drug dealer is going to pay a tariff on fentanyl? Fentanyl's not being tariffed. That's just sort of some kind of mistaken notion. But this isn't going to happen. And as I've stated, there's more fentanyl going from the U.S. into Canada than there is coming from Canada in the U.S. It's not a real emergency. It's being used to place a tax on the American people. But already we've seen a response from Canada. In response to a threat of tariffs, Canada announced a $1.3 billion plan dedicated to border security, to up border security on fentanyl, and yet the tariffs are still coming despite their help, but they've also announced more tariffs as well. The threat of tariffs seems to have worked. We need to not make Canada and America go through this when they've already responded to our requests. The chaos of one day the tariffs are on, one day they're off, next day there's a loophole for this industry or that industry is chaotic and is leading to turmoil in our markets. A week ago, when the thought of tariffs came forward, the markets plunged into historically low levels. The tariffs on Canadian imports, the tariffs on Mexican imports, the tariffs on European imports, the chaos it creates in the marketplace makes it difficult to plan for businesses. The interesting thing also about the tariffs is some have said, well, you know, the people will see that we're standing up for them with tariffs and we're for America first. And yet, when we put tariffs on historically, it has been Republicans. In 1890, McKinley put tariffs on. He was all for it, and still there are people lauding McKinley. 1890, the big McKinley tariff goes on. Do you know what happens in 1892? Of 170 Republicans, they lost 100 seats because prices went up with tariffs. Has this ever happened before? Yep, it happened in the 1840s when they put on the tariff of abominations under John Quincy. He signed it. Once again, the ruling party lost seats. When's the last time this happened in dramatic fashion? Well, if you study history and you want to know when the Republicans went to their lowest ebb in the entire history of our country, it came after the Hart-Smuley tariff in the early 1930s. Hoover was the president, a Republican. Republicans controlled Congress. They passed this dramatic tariff, which most historians and most economists now say prolonged the Depression for 10 years and caused the worst part of the Depression to actually be in 1937, 7 years after the tariff and nearly 8 years after the stock market crash. Do you know what happened to the Republicans in 1932? The Democrats won the presidency. They won the House. Do you know when Republicans got back in charge after 1932? 1994 in the House and in the 80s in the Senate. They went 50, 60 years into the desert because tariffs were such a turmoil to the country that the country rejected Republicans for nearly half a century. The emergency declaration we're considering today is unprecedented. By declaring an emergency, the President invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. They call it IEPA. It's an acronym. Don't get me started about government acronyms. But anyway, it's a law that's been used to put sanctions on like Iran. That's what it was intended for, but it was never intended for tariffs, and the words tariffs don't appear in the law. Using this bill to impose tariffs is attractive to a president. He doesn't have to work with the messiness of democracy, the messiness of Congress. But you know what? That messiness is a check and a balance on power. Unlike most of our trade laws that require several procedural hurdles, IEPA just says declare an emergency, and it becomes very hard for Congress to overturn this. When the Trump administration first implemented tariffs on China, it took 11 months before the tariffs could take effect. By using IEPA, the technique now, the tariffs have an almost immediate effect. But we're not at war with Canada. I don't even think we have real disagreements with Canada. They're an ally that buys more of our stuff than almost any other country in the world. Expediency is not the same as legality, though. As legal scholars have pointed out, there is reason to believe that this bill, this IEPA, this emergency bill, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs for at least two reasons. First, despite broad powers conferred to the president by this act, the plain, simple text does not mention the ability to impose a tax, tariff, or duty. It runs counter to Congress's habit of clearly referencing tariff authorities in other trade statutes. This may explain why no previous president has attempted to use emergency powers to raise tariffs. Second, it's difficult to see how using this emergency power, this IEPA Act, and a national emergency to post tariffs would comport with something called the major doctrines question, or major questions doctrine. Under this doctrine, the Supreme Court will reject claims of an executive on issues of vast economic and political significance. It's hard to imagine that a 25% tax on everything from Canada would not be considered to be of vast economic significance. Congress has not clearly empowered this administration. I think it's hard to even argue that it's ambiguous. The power was never granted. This question is ripe, and this power is ripe to be rejected by the Supreme Court. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports from Canada are at issue here. Clearly, this is a major economic question. Yet Congress has not expressly delegated the authority to impose tariffs to the president. We need to return to constitutional government. We used to abide by the ancient principle of no taxation without representation. One of the first acts enacted into the law was the Tariff Act of 1789, which sought to generate by placing a 5% tax on all imported goods, and was signed into law after passage by Congress by George Washington. Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers is well known, and according to Professor Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth, virtually every tariff recommendation put forth in the report was adopted by Congress in 1792. But simply voting on tariffs does not convert them into a good idea. It could make them constitutional. It could make this legal if Congress voted on it. It would still be economically a bad idea. As we move forward in this debate, you'll see that there are people on both sides of the aisle who question really whether we should be ruled by one person or whether the power should be separated. To me, this is not a partisan question. Some will try to make it a partisan question. To me, it makes no difference whether the president is Republican or Democrat. This is about the distribution of power. This is about the separation of power. This is about the admonition that Montesquieu gave us, that when the executive power and the legislative power are united in one person, there can be no liberty. Our founding fathers all believed that. They so feared the power of taxation that they gave it only to Congress. They so feared the power of taxation that they gave it specifically to originate in the House before it came to the Senate, because the House was closer to the people with elections every 2 years. This goes against the traditions of our country. I stand to speak against these tariffs. I stand to speak against these emergencies. I stand against the idea of skipping democracy, of skipping the constitutional republic, of rejecting our founding principles, not because I have any animus towards the president. I do this because I love my country and I want to see the division of power enabled such that it protects us all from the amalgamation of power into one person such that it can be abused. Another name for emergency rule is martial law. Who would want to live under one person? That's the thing we all object to in all the countries around the world that we object to is the idea that they don't have democratic rule. We should vote. This is a tax, plain and simple. Taxes should not be enacted by one person. So I will vote today to end the emergency. I will vote today to try to reclaim the power of taxation, the power of the tariff, to where the Constitution designated it should properly be, and that is in Congress. Thank you, Madam President.